The Victorians were obsessed with women's bodies to a degree that sounds absolutely deranged today. They measured waists with tape measures at dinner parties, locked their daughters into polished metal belts, and even inspected bedsheets for blood to prove a bride's innocence. Imagine living under that constant gaze. Every rib, every curl of hair, every ounce of flesh treated as public property. Compared to that, today's feminine standards look almost merciful. And before we sink into this long night of bizarre rules and suffocating corsets, do me a favor, subscribe. Otherwise, I'll just be left here talking into the silence, the same way Victorian women were, ignored in their own homes. Don't leave me to share their fate. While you're at it, let me know in the comments. What time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating to see this strange little community of insomniacs scattered across the world. So dim the lamps, settle into your pillow, and let's wander through a world where a woman's worth was stitched, powdered, and locked into place. You wake up in 1870s London, the coal smoke still heavy in the air from the factories that never stop churning, and yet the first thing on your mind is not survival, not breakfast, not even fresh air. It's how pale you look in the mirror. Because in this world, paleness isn't a symptom of vitamin deficiency. It's the mark of refinement. The less blood that seems to be circulating in your face, the more your family can brag about you at dinner. Welcome to the cult of fragility, the Victorian obsession that turned weakness into a selling point. They called it the angel in the house ideal. The perfect Victorian woman was pure, submissive, and, above all else, delicate. She was supposed to look as if a strong breeze might knock her flat on the fainting couch. In fact, that's why fainting couches were household staples. Entire pieces of furniture existed to accommodate the sudden collapses that came from being tightly laced, underfed, and powdered into near unconsciousness. Now, don't get the wrong idea. They didn't want women actually collapsing in the street. That would be vulgar. They wanted you to cultivate the appearance of fragility, pale skin, thin wrists, hollow cheeks, and a languid posture that suggested you'd never so much as lifted a basket of laundry in your life. Why? Because fragility was a class marker. Pale skin meant you weren't working in the fields under the sun. Weakness meant you didn't have to work at all. Delicacy became a badge of honor, a way to display family wealth without saying a word. The body itself became a billboard for status. And so, entire industries sprang up to help women look appropriately fragile. Cosmetics were part of it, though of course cosmetics had to be used discreetly. Respectable women were not supposed to be caught painting their faces. That was for actresses and prostitutes. But if your natural skin tone wasn't quite ghostly enough, you could quietly reach for powders laced with lead or lotions infused with mercury. Both could strip years off your life. But hey, at least your complexion looked ethereal while you were still alive. Imagine it. You sit at your vanity, brushing powder across your cheeks until you resemble a porcelain doll. You know it's toxic. You know it burns. But what's a little organ failure when marriage prospects are on the line? Even stranger, arsenic pills were sold as beauty aids. Women actually ingested poison in pursuit of that perfect alabaster glow. Nothing screams health like anemia marketed as desirable. You weren't meant to look like you could run up a hill. You were meant to look as though you might cough gently into a lace handkerchief at any moment, tragically delicate, like a character from a serialized novel. This obsession with fragility wasn't just about appearances. It was moralized. A sickly look was tied to spiritual purity. The thinner, paler, and weaker you appeared, the closer you were to angelic. And if you're wondering what kind of twisted logic equates tuberculosis chic with holiness, well, the Victorians were masters of that kind of mental gymnastics. Tuberculosis, in fact, became almost fashionable. It was called the romantic disease. Doctors and poets alike described it as giving women a fragile beauty, flushed cheeks, shining eyes, and a slender figure as the disease wasted the body away. Women actually envied consumptive looks, not realizing that the glow of fever was less glamour and more death sentence. If you were healthy and robust, that was a problem. It made you look coarse, common, like a woman who had to work for a living. No one wanted to be mistaken for the maid. Better to cultivate an image of fragility, even if it meant slowly killing yourself with chemicals and starvation diets. Even posture was policed. Sitting upright with too much vigor was unfeminine. Better to recline, to droop slightly, to appear as though the effort of keeping your head erect was almost too much. Fashion magazines advised women on how to carry themselves with appropriate languor. There were even tips on how to let your eyelids flutter just enough to suggest weakness without actually passing out. It was performance art, staged daily in drawing rooms across Britain, and men loved it, or at least they claimed to. A fragile wife was a controllable wife. A fainting woman wasn't going to argue back. She was going to sigh, recline, and leave the important matters to her husband. Fragility was a form of social control dressed up as beauty. Now, from our modern perspective, this all sounds absurd. Imagine walking into a room today and having someone say, "You look wonderful," positively consumptive. You'd probably call an ambulance. But in the Victorian world, that was a compliment. The cruel irony is that women themselves enforced these ideals just as much as men did. Mothers taught their daughters to prize paleness, to avoid sunlight, to stay indoors and cultivate their delicacy. Girls were scolded for running, for playing too vigorously, for developing muscles. Exercise was seen as unfeminine. The ideal was not health, it was display. Women were expected to be ornaments, not participants. Of course, not everyone fit this mold. Working-class women couldn't afford fragility. They were hauling coal, scrubbing laundry, and surviving childbirth with little medical support. Their hands were calloused, their bodies strong, and they were mocked as unfeminine for it. The cult of fragility was a luxury of the middle and upper classes, but it defined womanhood as a whole, leaving everyone else to fall short. And here's the thing. Victorian men didn't actually want their wives to be too fragile. Someone had to raise the children, run the household, and keep everything together. But socially, fragility remained the gold standard. It was a contradiction everyone seemed willing to ignore, because appearances mattered more than reality. So you, lying there in your imaginary Victorian bed, are expected to rise with a complexion white as linen, hair brushed into obedient waves, and a frame that suggests you haven't eaten more than a sugar biscuit in weeks. Your role is not to be healthy, but to be admired from a distance, like a porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece. And the worst part? Many women internalize this ideal so deeply that they truly believed their worth lay in their weakness. Diaries from the period reveal women despairing when they gained weight or lost their pallor. They wrote of envying consumptive friends, of longing for a more delicate look, of fearing they were too robust to be loved. The cult of fragility worked because it seeped into the very bones of culture. It wasn't just fashion, it was morality, medicine, and motherhood all tied into one suffocating package. And yet, underneath the powders and fainting spells, real women endured. They raised families, kept households running, wrote letters, played music, and dreamed of lives bigger than the narrow cage of fragility allowed them. Their strength was invisible, hidden under layers of lace and lead powder. But it was there. The Victorian ideal demanded weakness, but women kept surviving anyway. And that contradiction between the image and the reality is what makes the cult of fragility such a haunting piece of history. So, lie back. Imagine the faint rustle of skirts, the heavy air of a coal-smoked London morning, and the quiet pressure of a society that decided your value lay not in what you could do, but in how close you could get to looking like you were already halfway to the grave. You're standing in front of a mirror in 1875, and someone is pulling at the laces on your back. Not gently, not thoughtfully. They're yanking with both hands, bracing a knee against your spine for leverage. The goal is simple: to make your waist disappear. 16 inches, 18 at the most. That's the fashionable target. Never mind that your ribcage has other ideas. This is the corset, the central symbol of Victorian womanhood. Steel-boned, tightly laced, and utterly unforgiving. It wasn't just underwear. It was architecture. An entire scaffold designed to reshape the female body into something the male imagination found pleasing. Corsets had existed before the Victorians, but it was in this era that they reached new extremes. The waist obsession turned competitive. Women measured themselves, compared inches, and whispered about who had achieved the smallest circumference. A respectable waistline was not a number you bragged about. It was a number you endured. Now let's be clear. Not every woman laced herself to fainting point. Some wore their corsets more loosely, treating them as supportive garments rather than torture devices. But fashion magazines, etiquette manuals, and social pressure all pushed the idea that tighter was better. A cinched waist meant discipline, refinement, femininity. To let your corset out a notch was practically a moral failure. The health consequences were predictable, though rarely admitted in polite company. Organs displaced, stomachs compressed, lungs restricted until deep breaths became luxuries. Women fainted so often that the fainting couch became a standard piece of furniture. Picture it, a lounge chair designed specifically for collapsing gracefully when your blood supply finally rebelled. And fainting wasn't necessarily embarrassing. In the twisted logic of Victorian society, it could even enhance your reputation. Passing out didn't mean you were weak. It meant you were fashionable. You had cinched yourself into social approval so tightly that oxygen had become optional. Doctors occasionally raised alarms. They wrote about digestive troubles, miscarriages, even deaths linked to tight lacing. But these warnings were often drowned out by fashion columnists insisting that beauty required sacrifice. And women, trapped in a culture that valued appearances above health, had little choice but to comply. Let's put you in the middle of it. Imagine sitting down for afternoon tea while wearing a corset pulled tight enough that every sip of liquid feels like an invasion. You try to nibble a small cake, but there's no room for food. Your stomach has been pushed up into your diaphragm. Breathing is shallow, conversation forced through clenched teeth. Still, you smile politely, because that's what's expected. The other guests are doing the same, pretending not to notice that half the women in the room look one lace pull away from unconsciousness. Corsets were marketed as supportive, even healthy. Advertisements claimed they improved posture, prevented spinal deformities, and offered necessary structure for women's bodies. There's some truth to the posture part. A corset did keep your back straight, but it also kept your ribs from expanding, your muscles from developing, and your lungs from filling properly. In other words, it supported you by turning you into a mannequin. The irony is that men wore corsets too, though less frequently and usually in early adulthood. Military officers sometimes laced themselves for a trim figure in uniform. But for women, the corset wasn't optional. It was daily armor, worn from adolescence until middle age. Girls as young as 5 or 6 were put into training corsets to mold their bodies early. By the time they reached marriageable age, their rib cages had already been permanently reshaped. Think about that. The human skeleton deliberately deformed to meet an aesthetic ideal. Not with surgery, but with years of daily pressure. Bones softened by youth, gradually bending inward. And all this was considered normal. Yet, despite the pain and risk, corsets had defenders, many of them women. Some genuinely liked the look, others found comfort in the structure, and many argued that men were exaggerating the dangers. But beneath those defenses was the reality of social coercion. You couldn't exactly show up at a ball or a wedding without a corset and expect to be taken seriously. To reject the garment was to reject respectability itself. Corsets also carried symbolic weight. They represented control, not just of the body, but of the mind. A tightly laced woman was seen as disciplined, restrained, morally upright. A loose corset suggested looseness of character. The body became a visible metaphor for virtue. If your waist was under control, so was everything else. And then there was the theater of it all. Lacing wasn't done privately. It was often performed by another person, a maid, a sister, even a husband. The act itself became a ritual of submission, one person pulling the strings while the other endured the consequences. For the upper classes, corsets were often custom-made by skilled dressmakers. They were expensive, finely stitched, sometimes even decorated. For the poor, cheaper versions existed, stiff, ill-fitting, mass-produced. But no matter your class, the expectation was the same. Cinch yourself in. Of course, not every story was grim. Some women played with the rules, loosening their laces in private, or switching to less restrictive stays when they could. Others mocked the extremes, joking about friends who fainted more often than they danced. But even humor carried risk. To laugh too loudly about corsets was to suggest you weren't taking your figure seriously, and that could damage your reputation. From our modern perspective, corsets look like pure oppression. But it's important to remember the complexity. Many women saw them as necessary tools, even sources of confidence. A well-fitted corset could improve posture, support heavy gowns, and create the fashionable silhouette. The problem wasn't the garment itself, so much as the cultural obsession that demanded ever smaller waists, regardless of the cost. So here you are, back in that imaginary Victorian parlor, sipping weak tea, smiling faintly, and wondering how much longer you can last before gravity wins. Your ribs ache, your lungs beg for air, but you don't complain. Because in this society, discomfort is elegance, suffering is beauty, and silence is the price of admission. The corset wasn't just fabric and steel. It was ideology made wearable. A daily reminder that your body wasn't yours. It was a canvas for other people's standards. Every tug of the laces was another hand on your life, pulling you tighter, narrower, quieter. And if you passed out, well, at least you did it fashionably. But if you don't subscribe, I'll just keep talking myself breathless, just like those women who laced themselves silent. Don't leave me gasping alone. You thought the corset was bad enough, the laces digging into your ribs, the shallow breaths, the fainting spells. But the Victorians were only warming up, because once your waist was neatly whittled down to the size of a child's arm, the next step was to surround it with as much fabric as humanly possible. Enter the crinoline, a structure so wide, so impractical, and so combustible that it turned women into walking fire hazards. Imagine putting on a skirt that doesn't just brush against your ankles. No. This one is supported by a cage of steel hoops, layered and stacked until you resemble a bell turned upside down, 6 feet across in some cases. The idea was to make the waist look even smaller by comparison. It's a visual trick, tiny in the middle, vast everywhere else. Your silhouette wasn't supposed to say, "I'm a healthy human being." It was supposed to scream, "I am an hourglass drawn by a deranged architect." And it worked, at least visually. Society adored the crinoline. Magazines praised its elegance, artists painted it endlessly, and fashionable women tottered through doorways sideways just to keep up with the trend. But for the wearer, life became a daily obstacle course. Let's try it on. You step into the hoops, your maid lowers layers of petticoats over them, and finally the dress itself. Suddenly, your personal space has expanded dramatically. You can't sit close to anyone. You can't walk through narrow hallways without grazing the walls. If you want to sit down, you have to perch carefully, hoping the hoops collapse gracefully, rather than springing up to reveal far more than you intended. And then there were the carriages. Oh, the carriages. Picture yourself trying to climb into a horse-drawn cab while wearing what is essentially a steel birdcage around your lower half. Every movement becomes a negotiation. Will you fit? Can you angle yourself sideways? Will the driver sigh loudly while you wrestle your skirt into submission? By the time you're seated, half your petticoats are bunched around your chin, and the other half are spilling out the carriage door. Romantic, isn't it? But inconvenience was just the beginning. Crinolines were dangerous. Open flames were everywhere in Victorian homes. Fireplaces, candles, gas lamps. And nothing pairs better with hoop skirts made of highly flammable fabric than a roaring fire. Newspapers of the time carried horrifying stories. Women brushing too close to a grate and bursting into flames. Skirts catching on candles at balls. Entire gowns consumed before help could arrive. Thousands of deaths were attributed to crinolines igniting. And society's reaction? Not to abandon the fashion. Oh no. Instead, magazines reminded women to be cautious, as if keeping your 6-foot-wide hoop skirt away from fire in a house lit entirely by candles was a reasonable safety tip. All this, as one sarcastic commentator of the time put it, just to turn doorways into obstacle courses. And they weren't wrong. Whole buildings had to adapt. Ballrooms widened their entrances. Churches complained about space in pews, and households sighed as furniture was scraped and scuffed by passing skirts. Servants muttered about the sheer effort of laundering acres of fabric. But fashion ruled supreme. And of course, the crinoline wasn't just about aesthetics. Like the corset, it was symbolic. The exaggerated width made it physically difficult for women to move freely, run, or even work. The skirt created distance, a literal barrier of steel and fabric that marked a woman as ornamental, untouchable, separate from the world. Men didn't wear crinolines. Servants didn't wear them either. They were status made visible, and dangerous. By the 1870s, the crinoline began to fall out of favor. Not because people suddenly realized it was absurd, but because fashion shifted. The gigantic bell shape gave way to the bustle, a structure that moved the volume to the back of the body. Instead of taking up 6 feet of space in every direction, now the goal was to emphasize the backside, creating a profile that looked, to modern eyes, suspiciously like a shelf. Bustles were padded, wired, and sometimes spring-loaded. Yes, spring-loaded. The contraption pushed the skirt out behind the wearer, making it appear as though a small sofa cushion had been permanently attached to her lower back. Some were subtle. Others were so exaggerated they looked cartoonish, like the woman was smuggling a cannonball under her skirts. Sitting down in a bustle was its own adventure. The padding shifted, the wires creaked, and you were never entirely sure whether the skirt would cooperate or stage a minor rebellion. Walking wasn't much better. The bustle turned every step into a performance, fabric swaying and bouncing behind you as if it had a life of its own. And yet, women endured it. Because fashion isn't really about comfort. It's about what society demands. A tiny waist framed by an enormous skirt or accentuated by a ridiculous bustle told the world you were respectable, wealthy, and obedient to the trends of your time. Of course, satirists had a field day. Cartoons of the era mocked women for resembling teapots, balloons, or architectural experiments gone wrong. Men grumbled about being elbowed out of carriages. Writers joked about husbands losing sight of their wives behind their own skirts. But ridicule didn't kill the trend. Fashion magazines still promoted bustles as the height of elegance. Let's pause here and really put you in the scene. You're attending a dinner party in London. Your crinoline already replaced by the newer bustle. You walk carefully into the room, aware of the mountain of fabric trailing behind you. As you try to sit, you hear the springs shift ominously. The chair groans under the weight of your skirts. You sip your soup delicately, praying your backside doesn't knock over the candlesticks. Every movement is a negotiation between dignity and disaster. And yet, around you, every other woman is doing the same. No one questions the absurdity because absurdity shared is normal. That's the great trick of fashion. It convinces everyone to participate in the same inconvenience until it feels natural. The cult of silhouette, whether through crinolines or bustles, was about more than fabric. It was about control. Women's bodies were reshaped, exaggerated, immobilized, and displayed, all under the guise of beauty. And the women themselves were left to navigate the daily reality of living inside cages and cushions while pretending it was all perfectly comfortable. Looking back, the whole thing seems laughable. Who in their right mind would voluntarily walk around in a steel cage that might catch fire at any moment? But that's the power of cultural obsession. When society tells you this is elegance, you obey, even if it means scraping through doorways sideways and risking spontaneous combustion in front of the fireplace. So next time you pull on a pair of slightly tight jeans and grumble, remember? At least you're not dragging around 50 pounds of fabric on a skeleton of steel hoops, praying you don't knock over the furniture or burst into flames. Compared to Victorian fashion, your inconveniences look merciful. You're sitting at your vanity in 1870, and before you even think about breakfast, you're already brushing, and brushing, and brushing. 100 strokes a night was the recommendation, though really, no one ever stopped counting. The important part was to keep going until your arm ached and your scalp felt raw. Because in Victorian Britain, hair wasn't just hair. It was morality, respectability, and beauty, all wound into a single endless strand. They called it a woman's crowning glory. The longer, thicker, and shinier your hair, the more virtuous you were assumed to be. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a moral compass. A short haircut might as well have been a scarlet letter. The message was simple. Your hair was public proof of your private virtue, which means you're expected to grow it until it hangs like a curtain down your back, heavy enough to give you headaches and impressive enough to impress strangers who have no business caring about your scalp. Hair was tied, quite literally, to femininity. To cut it short was to cut away your social worth. Women who lost their hair through illness or accident were pitied or even shunned, as if baldness reflected not just their bodies, but their souls. A thick mane, on the other hand, suggested fertility, health, and purity. In other words, you'd make a fine wife. And of course, that was the point of everything in Victorian womanhood. Now, growing naturally thick hair was a lottery win most people couldn't control. So, the Victorians did what Victorians always did when faced with impossible standards. They cheated quietly while pretending not to. Hairpieces and wigs became a booming business. Switches, long sections of false hair, were clipped in to add volume or length. Some women wore full wigs, though discreetly, because heaven forbid anyone admit their own head wasn't abundant enough. Where did all this hair come from? Here's where things get less glamorous. There was an entire trade in human hair, and much of it came from the poor. Women sold their hair to wig makers for a few coins, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes as their only marketable asset. Locks were cut from the heads of servant girls, peasants, and even corpses. Yes, grave robbing occasionally extended to hair. You, brushing your glossy mane in your townhouse, might be clipping in the strands of a girl who pawned her youth for bread, or worse, a stranger who didn't exactly volunteer. The demand was insatiable. Fashion required hair thick enough to style into elaborate braids, coils, and buns the size of small birds' nests. Illustrated magazines showed women with sculptural arrangements towering above their heads, all secured with pins that could double as weapons. Maintaining these hairstyles wasn't just difficult, it was exhausting. Entire mornings could be devoted to curling, braiding, pinning, and decorating hair. It wasn't just crowning glory, it was architectural glory. And because natural hair couldn't always hold up to the demand, Victorian ingenuity stepped in with lotions and tonics designed to stimulate growth. The ingredients, predictably, were disastrous. Some used lead acetate, others leaned on mercury. Arsenic made its appearance here too. Because apparently, in Victorian beauty culture, no body part was safe from a little poison. Advertisements promised that a dab of this or a rinse of that would transform thinning locks into cascades of silk. In reality, these potions often did the opposite, irritating scalps, inflaming skin, and in some cases, causing hair to fall out entirely. Nothing says irony like losing your crowning glory thanks to the very tonic that promised to preserve it. Let's not forget the oils. Castor oil, bear grease, even beef marrow were massaged into hair as conditioners. Imagine going to bed with animal fat rubbed into your scalp and waking up with your pillow smelling like a butcher's stall. But if it kept your hair glossy, it was worth it, or so women were told. For many, hair care was a daily ritual bordering on religion. You, sitting there with your brush, would spend long minutes untangling knots, counting strokes, and listening to the faint tap-tap as strands fell into the tray below. Servants collected those fallen hairs and saved them. Nothing went to waste. Strands were woven into keepsakes, braided into jewelry, or recycled into hairpieces. The idea that part of you might end up as someone else's natural-looking bun wasn't strange at all. It was business as usual. And let's talk about mourning. When someone died, their hair was often clipped, braided, and worked into jewelry. Rings, brooches, lockets. Families wore these mementos as tokens of grief. In theory, it was touching. In practice, it meant the Victorian hair industry was busy on both sides of life and death. Of course, hairstyles themselves had moral weight. Loose hair, for example, was scandalous. It suggested wildness, sensuality, or, worst of all, availability. Respectable women kept their hair braided, coiled, or pinned, tucked away like dangerous knowledge. Letting your hair down wasn't a figure of speech. It was a risk. The only times a woman could safely unpin her hair were in the privacy of her bedroom or during illness. Otherwise, it was locked up, just like every other part of her life. So picture it. You're expected to brush endlessly, oil liberally, clip in extra strands when needed, and pin everything into an acceptable arrangement before stepping out the door. And God help you if a breeze dislodges a curl. A loose tendril could spark gossip. Too much visible hair. Too little visible hair. Hair that looked too rich. Hair that looked too poor. All of it subject to public judgment. The contradiction, of course, is that men wrote endlessly about how much they admired women's natural beauty, especially their natural hair. Meanwhile, women were expected to spend hours each day making sure that natural look was anything but natural. Wigs, switches, false curls, all hidden under the pretense of authenticity. If that sounds familiar, it should. History has a way of recycling the same hypocrisies, only with different packaging. Hair carried economic weight too. The poorer you were, the more tempting it became to cut it off and sell it. A healthy head of hair could be exchanged for food, rent, or medicine. Entire villages in Europe became known for supplying hair to London wig makers. This trade was both practical and humiliating. Imagine having to barter away part of your identity just to survive. Meanwhile, wealthier women clipped in those strands without a second thought. They paraded their enhanced manes at balls and garden parties, while the original owners vanished back into obscurity. It was beauty at someone else's expense, a literal display of inequality woven into every braid. There's something almost cruel about how much pressure was loaded onto hair. It wasn't enough to look pale and delicate. Your head had to broadcast moral worth, fertility, and class status all at once. And if your natural growth fell short, you were expected to fix it, no matter the cost. So here you are, in your imaginary Victorian mourning. The brush moves through your hair again and again, your arms stiff, your scalp tingling. A servant quietly collects the fallen strands, tucks them away, perhaps to be spun into a new piece for you or sold to someone else entirely. The oils leave a sheen, the pins lock it all in place, and the weight of it, literal and symbolic, presses down. You smile faintly in the mirror, not because you feel beautiful, but because you look acceptable. And that was enough in Victorian Britain. Hair was not yours. It was a performance, a commodity, a legacy, and a judgment all at once. The faint rustle of pins and the heavy scent of oils fade as you settle back. Hair coiled neatly, reputation intact. But remember, this crown is heavy, and like everything else in this era, the beauty came with a cost. You're standing in front of your mirror, and what do you see? A perfectly ordinary human face, warm skin, a few freckles, maybe a little color in your cheeks. In any other time in history, that might be perfectly fine. But in Victorian Britain, looking alive was a problem. The ideal face wasn't warm or healthy. It was pale, smooth, porcelain-like. And if you had to poison yourself to achieve it, well, so be it. Welcome to the cosmetic rituals of the 19th century, where arsenic was sold as a beauty supplement, lead powders coated your cheeks, and mercury crept into your daily routine. Victorians were terrified of female sexuality, but obsessed with female appearance, and skin, more than anything, became the surface where purity and beauty were staged. Let's start with the powders. White skin wasn't just a preference, it was a social marker. Pale complexions told the world that you didn't labor outdoors. You weren't a servant scrubbing floors, nor a factory girl hauling coal. You were refined. You belonged indoors, sheltered, protected, ornamental, which meant that any hint of tan or natural warmth in your face had to be erased. Enter the lead-based powders. Women brushed this chalky substance across their cheeks and foreheads to achieve that prized whiteness. Of course, lead doesn't just sit harmlessly on the skin. It seeps in, damaging nerves, rotting teeth, causing tremors, sometimes even leading to death. But when the alternative was looking common, a little paralysis was apparently worth the risk. Then, there were arsenic wafers. Imagine this. You walk into a shop and discreetly buy a little box, marketed with the promise of improving complexion. What you're really buying is poison in candy form. The wafers were said to lighten skin and smooth blemishes from the inside out. In reality, they slowly poisoned women, causing anemia, stomach issues, and in some cases, death. But in advertisements, arsenic was branded as the secret to eternal youth. Why age gracefully when you can poison yourself for youth? Mercury, too, found its way into Victorian beauty routines. Lotions containing mercury promised to erase freckles and blemishes. They often did, by chemically burning the top layer of skin off, leaving raw, damaged flesh beneath. Women applied these creams nightly, waking with red, inflamed skin, but told themselves it was proof the treatment was working. The logic was brutal. If it hurts, it must be effective. And all of this was tied to purity. Clear, pale skin wasn't just beauty. It was morality. Pimples? Those suggested poor habits, weak character, even sin. Smooth, spotless skin suggested virtue, innocence, and self-control. Cosmetics became a way to broadcast purity to the world, even when that purity was literally manufactured in a laboratory of poisons. But the face wasn't the only battleground. Victorians were deeply suspicious of natural body scent. Women weren't supposed to smell like humans. They were supposed to smell like roses, violets, or lavender. Anything delicate, floral, and controlled. Sweat was vulgar. Musk was immoral. Perfume wasn't indulgence. It was survival. You dab rosewater on your wrist before dinner, hoping your husband notices you smell like a garden, not a person. The irony. Rosewater did almost nothing to cover the actual odors of daily life. London was a stinking city, full of coal smoke, sewage, and rotting food. But for women, the expectation was that they would remain untouched by all of it, carrying around a bubble of floral fragrance as proof of their refinement. And perfume, too, wasn't always harmless. Some contained alcohols and additives that irritated the skin. Others were so heavily concentrated they triggered headaches or faintness. But fainting, as we've already established, could be fashionable. Cosmetics were also coded by class. Respectable women were expected to use them subtly, almost invisibly. Too much paint, too much perfume, and you risked looking like an actress or Worse, a prostitute. And yet, the same society that condemned painted faces also demanded women appear flawless. It was a rigged system. You had to use cosmetics, but pretend you weren't. Natural beauty was the goal, even if it took an entire apothecary's worth of poisons to achieve it. The hypocrisy is almost laughable. Women were told to look pure, innocent, untouched by vice, while dabbing mercury on their skin, swallowing arsenic, and dusting lead across their faces. Their bodies bore the cost of an illusion that society refused to acknowledge. And men, of course, praised the results without asking how they were achieved. Immersive moment. Picture yourself in your Victorian dressing room. You open a tiny tin of powder, the lead dust catching the candlelight. You pat it across your cheeks, watching your complexion dull into that prized chalk white. Next, you unwrap an arsenic wafer, placing it on your tongue like a sweet, even as your stomach turns. Finally, you dab rose water onto your wrists, breathing in the faint floral note, hoping it masks the reality of sweat and smoke. By the time you're finished, you look perfect, but under the surface, your body is quietly paying the price. Cosmetics weren't just about beauty. They were about erasing humanity. Pale skin, sweet scent, flawless texture, these were not natural states. They were performances of purity, carefully crafted and brutally enforced. The Victorian woman was expected to look less like a living being and more like a statue, smooth, silent, untouchable. The irony, of course, is that the men writing about feminine beauty often extolled natural charm, while holding women to impossible standards that required anything but natural effort. A woman was praised for her delicate complexion, never mind that she got it from swallowing poison. She was admired for her sweet scent, never mind that her real body odor was locked away under layers of perfume. She was pure because she looked pure. Reality had nothing to do with it. And so Victorian cosmetics became less about self-expression and more about survival. You weren't painting your face to feel confident. You were painting it to avoid shame, to secure marriage, to signal class, to prove your worth. The powders, perfumes, and lotions were weapons in a silent war, one fought in drawing rooms and dining halls, with the battlefield marked on your skin. From our perspective, it's easy to laugh. Who in their right mind would swallow arsenic for beauty? Who would smear lead on their cheeks? But before you scoff too loudly, consider modern products. How many chemicals do we rub, spray, or inject today in the name of beauty? History doesn't change as much as we like to think. The Victorians just did it with worse ingredients and more lace. So you settle back in your imaginary Victorian chair, your skin powdered white, your scent floral, your body quietly absorbing the damage. You smile faintly into the mirror, and the reflection that stares back isn't just yours. It's society's, projected onto your face, demanding purity at any cost. Because in the Victorian world, beauty was never really about you. It was about control, and control always came with a price. You're lying in bed in a Victorian house, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, because tonight isn't really about you. Tonight is an exam. Not an exam you chose, not an exam you studied for, and certainly not an exam you can retake. This is the wedding night, and the next morning your future and your family's reputation will be judged not by your vows, but by a blood stain on a sheet. Yes, welcome to the strange, suffocating world of Victorian virginity, where purity wasn't just personal, it was a public trial. Let's start with the basics. Virginity wasn't simply a private matter between two newlyweds. It was family business, community business, sometimes even national business if aristocratic bloodlines were involved. A bride's virtue was treated as property, her father's, her husband's, her family's, and proof of it was demanded, like a receipt. The absurdity begins even before the wedding night. Families occasionally arranged for doctors to perform virginity checks. That's right. Physicians were brought in to examine young women, as if the female body were a legal document that needed notarizing. Never mind that science already knew the hymen was unreliable evidence. A torn hymen could mean many things. No hymen at all? Perfectly natural in some women. But in Victorian logic, uncertainty wasn't a flaw. It was an opportunity to invent certainty where none existed. And where uncertainty lingered, the market stepped in. Artificial hymens were sold discreetly, tucked into advertisements for marriage aids and bridal preparations. These delicate little devices, inserted before the wedding night, promised to produce a convincing splash of blood, because if the sheet was going to be inspected, best to be prepared. Virginity could quite literally be bought. Imagine that pressure. You're lying there on your wedding night, not thinking about love or intimacy, but about stagecraft. Will it look convincing enough? Will the sheet pass inspection? You can't focus on the person beside you, because tomorrow morning, the entire household may be waiting. The maid will strip the bed, carry the linen out, and the proof of your worth will be displayed for family eyes. Romance? No. It was more like a medical audit with worse lighting. The double standard, of course, was staggering. Men were expected to arrive at marriage with experience. Their conquests, if whispered about at all, could even enhance their reputation. But women? Women were expected to remain utterly ignorant, stepping into marriage as both untouched and uninformed. Innocence was eroticized. Naivety was fetishized. You weren't supposed to know what was about to happen. And yet, you were supposed to perform it convincingly enough to leave physical evidence behind. And if you didn't, the consequences could be devastating. A missing bloodstain might spark rumors of prior misconduct. A husband might claim fraud. Families could be shamed, and women could be branded for life as fallen. One night, one sheet, a lifetime of judgment. The cruelty didn't stop there. Medical books of the era reinforced the idea that a woman's first duty was to provide proof of her virginity. Etiquette manuals hinted at it with euphemisms, warning brides that the wedding night was less about pleasure and more about responsibility. Even the church weighed in, framing the loss of virginity as a spiritual transition that needed to be visibly proven. The body became courtroom, altar, and evidence table all at once. Now, let's slip back into that POV. You're lying under the heavy canopy of a Victorian marriage bed. The room is dim, the fire sputtering low, and your mind races not with passion, but with fear. The man beside you might be gentle, or he might not. Either way, you're hyper-aware that tomorrow morning the housemaid will carry linen down the hall, and your family's honor will ride on what she holds in her arms. You try to breathe, to relax, but the silence is crushing. The weight of centuries of expectation presses down harder than any blanket. And here's the real kicker. Blood wasn't guaranteed. Many women simply didn't bleed during their first sexual experience, regardless of their virginity. Some did, some didn't. The body varies. But Victorian society didn't care about biology. It cared about performance. And so women lived in terror of failing a test they could never control. The market for deception thrived, Instructions circulated quietly among women about how to simulate the expected outcome, pricking a finger discreetly, for example, and staining the sheet yourself. Anything to satisfy the absurdity of the ritual. What mattered wasn't truth. What mattered was evidence. There's a dark humor in it if you step back far enough. An entire culture willing to stake a woman's honor, family reputation, and marriage prospects on whether or not a bedsheet needed soaking in vinegar the next morning. And yet, for the women living it, there was nothing funny about the fear. The obsession with virginity wasn't just about morality, it was about control. A woman who entered marriage untouched was a woman who had been successfully supervised by her parents, by her community, by the invisible web of gossip and expectation that wrapped around her from childhood. Virginity was proof not only of her purity, but of her family's ability to police her. It was surveillance dressed up as virtue. Of course, not everyone complied perfectly. Scandals erupted. Court cases dragged women's reputations through the mud. And in private diaries, some women admitted the terror, the shame, the absurdity of it all. A few even rebelled, finding lovers before marriage, defying the ritual, daring society to judge them. But those were exceptions, and exceptions were punished harshly. For most, the safest path was silence. Endure the trial, hope for the stain. Pretend the ritual made sense, and move on with the rest of married life, which often brought its own cage of expectations. Looking back, it's hard not to see the cruelty. The way intimacy was stripped of privacy, turned into a public spectacle. The wedding night wasn't about love, or even partnership. It was about proving property had been transferred intact. The bride wasn't a person so much as a contract to be inspected, signed, and stamped with approval. So when you hear nostalgic talk about Victorian romance, candlelit weddings, white gowns, poetic vows, remember the bedsheet. Remember the fear, the performance, the absurd little rituals designed to reduce human intimacy into evidence for other people's eyes. Because in this world, a single night defined you. And it wasn't about love. It was about proof. You're lying in a Victorian marriage bed, eyes closed, hands folded neatly on your stomach, body still as stone. Not because you're asleep, not because you're relaxed, but because this is what's expected. In this world, the safest way to survive intimacy is to act as though it isn't happening. Respectable women weren't supposed to enjoy sex. They weren't even supposed to acknowledge the possibility of enjoyment. The cultural script was clear. Passion belonged to men. Silence belonged to women. If you lay still, endured quietly, and carried on without complaint, you were considered virtuous. If you reacted, if you showed desire, if you moved even slightly toward pleasure, well, that was another story. That was dangerous. Desire in women was pathologized. It was medicalized, moralized, and punished all at once. Doctors warned that women who sought or enjoyed sexual intimacy were overly excitable or morally lax. They were at risk, supposedly, of developing hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis that became the dumping ground for anything society didn't like about women. Have a headache? Hysteria. Feel restless? Hysteria. Get angry at your husband? Definitely hysteria. Show signs of actual desire in bed? Hysteria with a capital H. The diagnosis was vague enough to fit almost anything, which was the point. It kept women under surveillance, reminding them that their bodies were not their own. Passion was something to be suppressed, and if suppression failed, the doctor would step in to treat the problem. Treatments ranged from the absurd to the invasive, cold baths, isolation, and of course, the infamous pelvic massages that eventually gave birth to the vibrator. But the underlying message was always the same. Women's pleasure wasn't natural. It was a disorder. So you, lying under those heavy sheets, keep your eyes closed and your breath steady. You don't move. You don't react. Because reacting might invite judgment. And judgment, in the Victorian world, was swift. A wife who showed enjoyment could be suspected of immorality. Pleasure suggested appetite. Appetite suggested corruption. Silence, on the other hand, suggested virtue. Think about how twisted that is. In a society that celebrated male conquest and male passion, women were taught that their highest achievement was to resemble furniture, to exist as passive, motionless objects, to be acted upon, never acting. Etiquette manuals even spelled this out. Brides were advised to submit with grace, but not to appear eager. Passion, they warned, was unfeminine. A good wife was calm, restrained, modest, and above all, silent. If that sounds less like marital advice and more like instructions for a hostage, well, you're not wrong. The cruelty of this system is that it denied women not just pleasure, but agency. Even within marriage, where intimacy should have been private, the public eye still intruded. Not literally, though the blood-stained sheets of Chapter 6 certainly suggest otherwise, but socially. The weight of gossip, of expectation, of invisible judgment filled the room like a third participant. You weren't alone. You were being watched, even in silence. And what did this surveillance achieve? It turned intimacy into another performance. Just as cosmetics turned skin into a stage for purity, and corsets turned waists into displays of discipline, sex itself became a theater of endurance. Women were judged not on their feelings, but on their ability to suppress them. Now, not every woman complied. Diaries and private letters reveal that some wives did find enjoyment, did express desire, did rebel against the script. But those stories were rare, whispered carefully, and often hidden for fear of discovery. Society wasn't ready to hear about female pleasure, at least not respectable society. That sort of thing was relegated to pornography, where women's passion was exaggerated into caricature, making it easier to dismiss in real life. Meanwhile, the medical establishment kept busy reinforcing the myth. Doctors argued that women were naturally less sexual than men, that their bodies were designed primarily for reproduction, not pleasure. Any signs to the contrary were labeled abnormal. The womb, they said, was sensitive, unstable, prone to wandering about the body and causing trouble if stimulated too much. That kind of pseudoscience justified the surveillance. If desire was pathology, then controlling it was medicine, and so passion was punished, silence praised. Let's sink deeper into the POV. You're lying there, still and obedient, while the fire burns low in the grate. Your mind drifts to tomorrow's chores, to the faint hum of the city outside, to anything but the body beside you. Because to engage, to lean into what's happening, would be to break the rules. You keep your eyes closed. You pretend. And if you're lucky, the performance ends quickly, leaving you free to retreat into sleep. This wasn't just repression, it was erasure. By denying women the right to their own pleasure, Victorian society effectively erased part of their humanity. Desire was dangerous, so it was denied. Intimacy became duty, a task to endure, another burden in a long list of expectations. From our modern perspective, it's easy to scoff, to say, why didn't they just rebel? But rebellion came with costs. social ostracism, ruined reputations, medical interventions. To be caught desiring was to be caught breaking the rules, and in a society obsessed with surveillance, very few risks felt worth it. Still, you can sense the cracks in the system. Behind closed doors, in coded diaries, in the faintest lines of poetry, women admitted to wanting more, to feeling more, to being more than what the culture allowed. Those whispers remind us that even under the heaviest silence, humanity persists. But for the majority, silence was safety. You learned to keep your eyes closed, your body still, your thoughts hidden. You endured, and endurance was praised as virtue. So when we talk about the Victorian obsession with women's bodies, it wasn't just about appearances. It was about control at every level. Skin, waist, hair, virginity, and even desire itself. Women were policed not only in how they looked, but in how they felt. The body was never private. Even pleasure was subject to surveillance. And you, lying under those sheets in that imaginary Victorian night, realize the cruelest truth of all. Even your silence isn't really yours. It belongs to them, to the culture, to the rules, to the invisible audience always watching. At least subscribing here proves someone's listening. Don't leave me talking into the void like they did. You're sitting stiffly in a Victorian doctor's office. The room smells faintly of coal smoke and disinfectant, the kind of place where science is supposed to happen. On the desk, there are vials, papers, a stethoscope. But your diagnosis today has nothing to do with your heart or your lungs. The doctor peers at you solemnly and declares the problem. Hysteria. Congratulations. You are officially suffering from the most popular catch-all disease of the 19th century. Hysteria could mean almost anything. Feeling anxious? Hysteria. Restless? Hysteria. Irritable with your husband? Definitely hysteria. In fact, if you were a woman and dared to express any emotion not deemed ladylike, you were at risk of being labeled hysterical. The word itself came from the Greek for uterus, hystera, because naturally, the Victorians assumed all female problems began and ended in the womb. Doctors insisted hysteria was an epidemic. Journals described it as a condition afflicting up to 3/4 of women at some point in their lives. That's right, 3 out of 4, which should probably have been a clue that this wasn't a medical crisis at all, but a cultural one. But instead of questioning the diagnosis, Victorian medicine decided to invent a cure, and that cure was pelvic massage. Yes, you heard that correctly. A doctor would sit you down, often behind a discreet curtain, and manually stimulate your genitals until you experienced what they politely called a paroxysm. We would call it an orgasm. For the Victorians, it was a medical treatment. Here's the logic, if we can call it that. Hysteria was caused by a buildup of female nervous energy. Release it, and the patient would return to her calm, dutiful, modest self, at least for a while. And so, physicians developed entire practices around producing these so-called paroxysms. Women booked appointments, symptoms were treated, and doctors pocketed their fees. But there was a problem. Hands get tired. Doctors were spending hours each day laboring over hysterical patients. Some even complained in medical journals about the physical strain. And so, necessity, or rather laziness, became the mother of invention. Enter the vibrator. The first devices were steam-powered contraptions, the size of furniture, buzzing loudly in the corner of clinics. Imagine sitting in a chair while a machine larger than a sewing cabinet rattled ominously nearby, Later versions became smaller, portable, even electrical as the technology advanced. By the late 19th century, vibrators were being marketed directly to women, not as sexual tools, of course, but as health appliances. They promised to treat nervous exhaustion, improve complexion, stimulate circulation, and cure hysteria in the comfort of your own home. Imagine needing a doctor's note for an orgasm. The hypocrisy is astounding. Victorian society insisted women weren't supposed to enjoy sex. Respectable wives were meant to lie still, endure, and stay silent. But those same women were now visiting clinics, receiving regular treatments, and later purchasing machines to bring the cure home. Female pleasure, erased from the bedroom, was reintroduced in the doctor's office, safely disguised as medicine. It's almost comic. A culture so determined to deny women sexual agency that it had to reinvent their pleasure as a medical disorder just to tolerate it. Now, let's slip into the immersive moment. You're sitting in that clinic, behind a discreet screen, hearing the faint hum of the new electrical device. The doctor, professional and detached, positions the machine. The sound fills the room, steady, mechanical, almost soothing. You focus on the wallpaper, on the ticking clock, trying not to think about the absurdity. You came here to be treated for hysteria. What you're really receiving is the only sanctioned form of sexual release available to a respectable Victorian wife. And here's the kicker. It worked. Women reported relief from their symptoms, which of course reinforced the diagnosis. Doctors congratulated themselves on curing hysteria, never acknowledging that what they were actually doing was providing pleasure under a false label. By the end of the century, vibrators were being sold through mail-order catalogs. Imagine flipping through the pages of a Sears catalog in 1899 and finding one advertised right between the egg beaters and the sewing machines. No one dared call it what it was. It was just another household appliance for circulation, for female complaints, for health. The wink and the nudge were implied but never spoken aloud. The existence of the vibrator in the Victorian world exposes the bizarre contradictions of the era. On the one hand, society condemned female sexuality, treating it as dangerous, immoral, even pathological. On the other hand, it invented, mass-produced, and distributed a machine designed specifically to relieve the very symptoms that suppression created. It was repression and indulgence, denial and delivery, all wrapped into one humming device. From our perspective, it's tempting to laugh. And you should, a little. The sight of a doctor complaining about sore wrists from treating too many patients does have a grim humor to it. But beneath the comedy lies the cruelty. Women's pleasure was not acknowledged as theirs. It was medicalized, supervised, controlled. Even in their most private moments, women weren't allowed to own their desire. They could only borrow it on prescription. So you settle back in that imaginary clinic, the hum of machinery filling the air. The doctor records your progress in his notes, satisfied that hysteria has once again been subdued. You leave calmer, lighter, not entirely sure what just happened, but aware you'll be back. Because this isn't a cure, it's maintenance. And maintenance, as always, is profitable. In the end, hysteria was never really about women's health. It was about society's need to keep women under control, to pathologize what it couldn't explain, and to monetize what it refused to admit existed. The vibrator, born out of this strange hypocrisy, stands as one of the most ironic inventions in history, a device designed to suppress female pleasure by delivering it. So when you hear the faint hum in the background of this story, remember, it wasn't liberation. Not yet. It was just another layer of Victorian surveillance. Only this time, mechanical. You're lying in bed in a Victorian nursery, the house dark, the coals smoldering low in the grate. You'd like to roll over, stretch, maybe even sneak a hand beneath the blanket for warmth. But you don't dare, because your nightgown has been stitched shut at the wrists. Your parents asked the seamstress to do it, and they did it out of love. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. Welcome to the war on masturbation, one of the strangest and cruelest battles fought in the 19th century. Not against armies, but against the private lives of children. Victorians were terrified of self-pleasure. Pamphlets, sermons, and medical manuals declared it the root of nearly every imaginable evil. Masturbation, they warned, would lead to blindness, insanity, epilepsy, infertility, weak character, early death. The list of horrors was endless, and none of it had any scientific basis. But when has that ever stopped a good moral panic? The paranoia wasn't entirely new. Warnings against masturbation date back centuries. But in the Victorian era, it reached fever pitch. Doctors, clergymen, and anxious parents turned it into a full-blown epidemic. Publications like Onania or Samuel Tissot's Onanism were republished and widely read, insisting that a single sinful act could drain the body of vital energy. Even respected medical journals printed dire warnings. And so prevention became obsession. Children were monitored like potential criminals. Parents checked bed sheets, interrogated habits, and invented elaborate devices to keep wandering hands in check. Spiked rings, worn around the genitals, were designed to inflict pain if touched. Chastity belts were reimagined for children, locked into place at night. Special gloves with locks or even mild electrical currents were marketed as safeguards. And then there were the nightgowns, stitched shut at the wrists or designed with mittens attached. Imagine going to bed each night wearing something closer to a straitjacket than pajamas. The message was clear: your body wasn't yours. It was property of morality, guarded by your parents and policed by fear. The irony, of course, is that this paranoia almost certainly had the opposite effect. By turning curiosity into crime, by surrounding the act with shame and fear, Victorians guaranteed that generations grew up with anxiety about their own bodies, and shame, once planted, lingers far longer than any stitched nightgown. Let's sink into the POV. You're lying there, small hands pinned inside fabric, heart thudding with the knowledge that your parents might come check on you at any moment. You don't understand exactly why. You only know that something about your body is dangerous, sinful, forbidden. The fear sits heavier than the blankets. You stare at the ceiling and count the seconds until sleep comes. And it wasn't just children. Adults, too, were targeted with the same warnings. Popular medical guides insisted that masturbation was the leading cause of everything from headaches to tuberculosis. Marriage was prescribed as the only safe outlet for desire, which worked nicely for reinforcing the family structure society wanted. If fear drove you to the altar early, all the better. Inventors cashed in on the panic. Patents were filed for anti-masturbation contraptions, belts, cages, alarms that rang if a child shifted too much in bed. Some devices were brutal, inflicting pain on anyone who tried to resist. Others were humiliating, locking away the body like contraband. And these weren't underground oddities. They were advertised in catalogs, sold in medical supply shops, and recommended by doctors. Parents complied. They bought the devices, stitched the gowns, preached the sermons. not because they hated their children, but because they feared for them. The great tragedy of the war on masturbation is how many adults believed they were saving their children's lives while inflicting trauma instead. The language of the panic was steeped in morality. Masturbation was framed not only as dangerous to the body, but also to the soul. Ministers thundered from pulpits about purity, tying self-control to salvation. A child caught in the act wasn't just breaking a rule, they were threatening their eternal soul. It's hard to imagine a heavier burden to place on a young mind. And yet, society maintained the hypocrisy. Male sexuality was winked at, indulged, even celebrated in certain circles. Brothels thrived. Prostitutes worked in every city. Men were allowed indulgence, provided they kept up appearances. Women, on the other hand, especially respectable women, were expected to embody restraint. And children, regardless of gender, were treated as dangerous vessels of temptation waiting to corrupt themselves. The obsession reveals more about Victorian anxiety than about human biology. It was a culture that needed control of the city, of the empire, of the household, and above all, of the body. Masturbation represented something terrifying to Victorians: independence, a pleasure that required no permission, no marriage, no authority figure. And that, perhaps more than the blindings and seizures and imaginary deaths, was the real threat. From our modern vantage, the panic is absurd. We laugh at the idea that touching yourself could cause tuberculosis. We shake our heads at spiked rings and stitched gowns, but the echoes linger. Generational shame, hushed conversations, discomfort with bodies, much of it can be traced back to these Victorian nightmares. Fear leaves deep roots. So let's return to that bed in the silent Victorian house. Your hands are stitched in place. The fire is dying. You close your eyes, not in peace, but in surrender. You're learning the lesson that society wants to teach you. Your body is not yours. And that lesson, whispered from pulpits, printed in pamphlets, reinforced by parents, will follow you into adulthood. Romantic, isn't it? Nothing says loving family values quite like sewing your child into a fabric prison to save them from themselves. The war on masturbation wasn't really about health. It was about control, fear, and the desperate attempt to police the private. A battle that could never be won, but was fought anyway. One spiked device and stitched gown at a time. You shift beneath the heavy quilt of a Victorian boarding school dormitory bed. The room is cold, draft slipping through the window panes, and the thin mattress offers little comfort. But what really keeps you awake isn't the chill of the air. It's the chill of steel. A metal belt presses against your hips, your thighs, your most private skin. The key is not yours. It never will be. It belongs to someone else, your father, your headmistress, perhaps a doctor. And that, to Victorians, was considered progress. Welcome to the reimagined chastity belt of the 19th century. Contrary to the myths about medieval maidens clanking around in iron underwear for decades at a time, chastity belts, as we picture them, rusted cages locked by jealous knights, were more legend than reality. But in the Victorian era, the legend came alive in cold steel thanks to industrial innovation and medical paranoia. The Industrial Revolution produced more than trains, factories, and bridges. It also produced new anxieties about the body and the technology to enforce them. With advances in metalworking and mass production, chastity devices could now be designed, manufactured, and sold in bulk. Advertisements coyly describe them as medical supports or protective appliances. The marketing language was vague, but the purpose was clear: preventing masturbation and preserving female virtue. And people bought them. Fathers ordered belts for their daughters. Boarding schools enforced their use on restless students. Doctors recommended them to worried parents. The Victorians didn't see cruelty in the practice. They saw morality. Imagine the routine. At night, you're fastened into the device. A padlock clicks shut. You shift, trying to find a comfortable position, but the steel pinches and digs. There's no escape. In the morning, if you're lucky, the key holder releases you. If not, you carry the weight of the belt into the day, the rigid frame biting into your clothes, a silent reminder that your body isn't your own. Nothing says love like padlocking your daughter. That sarcastic little truth is hard to escape. Parents convinced themselves they were acting out of protection, protecting daughters from sin, from temptation, from themselves. In reality, it was about control. Control enforced not by words, but by hardware. The devices came in many forms. Some resembled metal girdles, strapped tightly around the waist and thighs. Others were more elaborate, with spikes or plates positioned to deter any attempt at touching. Some were lined with softer material for comfort, though how much comfort you can find in being locked into a cage is debatable. Keys were kept by authority figures, fathers, schoolmasters, or guardians, ensuring that the wearer had no autonomy. In boarding schools, the practice was especially chilling. Young girls were subjected to inspections, devices fitted and locked in place, the keys hanging in the matron's office. The logic was simple. If you removed choice entirely, you removed risk. The result was an atmosphere of humiliation and fear. Dormitories weren't places of rest. They were warehouses of restrained bodies. The belts were often justified with medical rhetoric. Doctors warned that masturbation could cause everything from seizures to moral decay. Advertisements played into these fears, promising parents peace of mind. By locking up their daughters, they were told, they were safeguarding health and virtue alike. The cruelty was hidden behind the veil of science. After all, if a man in a white coat recommended it, surely it was progress, not punishment. Now imagine being that girl again, lying in bed with cold steel pressing into your skin. You try to shift, but the belt follows every move, unyielding. The room is silent, except for the sound of breathing from the other beds, rows of girls in the same situation. You wonder if anyone else is awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing the night would end. You wonder how many more nights there will be like this. The psychological weight was just as heavy as the physical. Wearing such a device wasn't only uncomfortable, it was degrading. It was a nightly reminder that you were not trusted, that your desires, natural or not, were viewed as dangerous, that your body required surveillance and restraint. What should have been the most private part of your being became the most policed. And let's not ignore the irony. A culture that claimed to prize innocence subjected its children to this ritual of suspicion and punishment. In trying to preserve purity, Victorians inflicted shame. And shame, once planted, doesn't fade easily. It grows roots deep into adulthood, shaping how a person views their body, their worth, their ability to trust themselves. Some belts were crude, hastily made contraptions that rusted quickly or caused infections. Others were finely crafted, polished devices, sold at higher prices to wealthier families. Status played a role even here. The upper classes could afford comfortable chastity belts, while poorer children endured cheap, ill-fitting versions. Control, like everything else, was tiered by class. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The idea of a father proudly locking away his daughter each night, thinking he was ensuring her moral safety. But behind the absurdity lies cruelty. For the girl inside the belt, it wasn't funny. It was humiliating, painful, and inescapable. Boarding schools in particular institutionalized the practice. Regulations were strict, inspections frequent. Privacy was non-existent. The belt became part of daily life, normalized through repetition, and in that normalization, the cruelty deepened. When everyone around you suffers the same indignity, it stops feeling strange. It just feels inevitable. The industrialization of chastity devices turned a medieval myth into a Victorian reality. Metalwork shops that might have produced buckles, tools, or household goods also turned out belts designed to cage flesh. The same ingenuity that built bridges and engines built prisons for teenage bodies. Progress, it turns out, can march in strange directions. Let's sink into the POV one last time. You're older now, perhaps back at home, but the memory lingers. You remember the weight of the belt, the sound of the lock clicking shut. You remember the helplessness of lying awake at night, listening to the faint creak of your parents' footsteps down the hall. Even when the belt is gone, the lesson remains. Your body belongs to others. And that was the real purpose of the reimagined chastity belt. Not prevention, not protection, but indoctrination. To teach submission so thoroughly that even without steel, the restraint remains. Victorian society sold it as virtue, as health, as progress. But in truth, it was fear. Fear of desire, fear of independence, fear of the body's natural impulses. And so, they locked away not only the body, but the spirit. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the noble values of the Victorians, picture the cold press of steel against skin, the padlock glinting in the candlelight, the key tucked safely in someone else's pocket. That was love, Victorian style. Because nothing says family values like padlocking your daughter at bedtime. You're standing in front of a gilt-edged mirror in a Victorian bedroom, staring at a body that apparently isn't good enough. Not thin enough, not round enough, not tall enough in the right places. No matter what you see, the message is always the same. It must be remodeled. Not with diet or exercise, those were barely in fashion yet. No, you'll fix it with padding, props, and contraptions strapped directly to your skin. Because in Victorian society, the ideal woman's body was never stable. It shifted constantly, reshaped by fashion's whim. And keeping up meant buying, wearing, and enduring endless layers of artificial enhancements. Bust improvers, hip pads, false rumps, crinolines, bustles, you name it. Someone in a London shop was selling it. The Victorians basically invented Photoshop, only you had to wear it. Let's start with the bust improvers. These were small cushions, sometimes filled with cotton or even horsehair, tied discreetly under your corset to plump the chest. If nature hadn't given you the fashionable silhouette, commerce would happily sell you one. The same logic applied to the hips. Pads could be tied on beneath skirts to exaggerate curves. Later, bustles would extend the backside dramatically, producing the famous shelf-like silhouette of the 1880s. It didn't stop there. The silhouette itself shifted every few decades. In the 1830s, wide shoulders and enormous sleeves were in vogue, giving women a top-heavy look. By the 1850s, attention had shifted downward, with crinolines expanding skirts into enormous bell shapes. So wide you practically needed planning permission to walk through a doorway. Then came the bustle era, when the fashionable backside jutted out like architectural scaffolding. Each new decade introduced a new ideal, and each ideal demanded new props. The result? A woman's body became a project, constantly under renovation. Now imagine the daily routine. You wake in the morning, already weary at the thought of preparation. First, you step into your chemise and drawers. Then the corset, laced tight, ribs protesting. Next, the bust improver, tied firmly into place. Then the hip pads, adjusted until they sit correctly. Over that, the crinoline cage or bustle frame, depending on the year. Then layers of petticoats, stockings, shoes, bodices, skirts, jackets, shawls. By the time you're finished, the body staring back at you in the mirror no longer feels like yours. It's an elaborate costume assembled for public approval. And that's the immersive image. You, patting your hips, tying on bust enhancers, adjusting the silhouette until you finally resemble the fashionable figure of the day. You step into society not as yourself, but as an imitation of whatever shape is currently being worshipped. The constant shifting of ideals wasn't accidental. It kept women buying. Fashion magazines, the ladies' newspaper, the Queen, and dozens more promoted the latest silhouettes relentlessly. Illustrations depicted the new ideal, and suddenly every woman in the middle and upper classes was scrambling to match it. Shops thrived on the cycle of dissatisfaction. Because if the ideal never stayed the same, you could never settle. You had to keep consuming. Sarcastic commentary practically writes itself. Congratulations, you're perfect, for this year only. Please report back in 10 years when your bust should be higher, your hips wider, and your backside shaped like a shelf. The irony is that women weren't fools. Many knew these shifting ideals were absurd, but social pressure left little choice. Appear at a ball without the correct silhouette, and you risked ridicule. Appear in society with a figure too natural, and you risked whispers about being poor or unfashionable. Better to endure the padding, even the discomfort, than to stand out in the wrong way. And the discomfort was real. Crinolines, for instance, were notoriously dangerous. Women caught them in carriage wheels, set them aflame over fireplaces, or found themselves blown about like sails in strong winds. Bustles were cumbersome, forcing awkward postures. Hip pads and bust improvers shifted uncomfortably throughout the day. The fashionable silhouette might have looked graceful in magazines, but wearing it was often an ordeal. There's also a darker side. These fashion props exaggerated not just physical form, but social hierarchy. A woman's body became a symbol of her family's wealth. If she could afford to reshape herself every decade, if she could afford the newest pads, bustles, and cages, she proved her status. Working-class women, meanwhile, often couldn't keep up, though they were still judged against the same ideals. The silhouettes trickled downward, becoming expectations for everyone, even those without the means to participate fully. Let's slip back into POV. You're dressed now, layers upon layers transforming you into the fashionable image. You walk into a drawing room, skirts swishing, bustle projecting behind you like a shelf, ready for someone to set down a teacup. Heads turn. No one sees you. They see the silhouette. And in their gaze, you realize something. You're not a person anymore. You're a shape, an outline, a fashionable figure defined by padding and props. The manipulation of the female form wasn't just about beauty. It was about distraction. With so much time, energy, and money spent sculpting silhouettes, women had less opportunity to challenge the system itself. The constant shifting of ideals kept them busy, chasing the next shape, the next purchase, the next approval. fashion became both armor and prison. And yet, within this cycle, women found small ways to reclaim agency. Some used the props playfully, exaggerating silhouettes to comic effect. Others rejected the latest shapes, choosing simpler gowns that emphasized comfort. But those choices were rare and often criticized. Most women, most of the time, conformed because the cost of nonconformity was too high. Looking back, the parallels with modern life are obvious. Today we have Photoshop, filters, and plastic surgery instead of bustles and hip pads. But the logic is the same. Reshape the body to match a fleeting, ever-changing ideal. Buy, conform, repeat. So let's return once more to that Victorian bedroom. You're untying the padding at the end of a long day, loosening the corset, peeling away the layers. The mirror reflects the real you for a brief moment, unpadded, unshaped, unenhanced. And maybe, just maybe, you let yourself sigh in relief. But you know tomorrow, it all begins again. Because in the Victorian world, your worth wasn't defined by who you were. It was defined by whether your silhouette matched the fashion plate. And fashion plates, unlike bodies, never stayed still. And if you don't subscribe, I'll feel just as disposable. Another outline, forgotten as soon as the page turns. The candle burns low on your writing desk. Outside, London is muffled with fog, and the coal smoke drifting in through the window makes your eyes water. But you barely notice, because you are in the grip of something far more intoxicating. Words. Your pen scratches across the paper, carrying with it feelings you dare not speak aloud. A poem, a letter, a small declaration of affection. Private, personal, secret. You fold it carefully, press it against your chest for a heartbeat, and seal it shut. For a moment, you feel safe. But here's the problem. In Victorian Britain, even ink could betray you. Desire wasn't just policed in the body, in fashion, in marriage beds, or in bedrooms. It was censored on the page. The very act of writing down longing, of putting affection into rhyme or prose, could be enough to drag you before a judge. Because words, just like bodies, were considered dangerous. The government made sure of that. In 1857, Parliament passed the Obscene Publications Act, Britain's first major law aimed at censoring literature. On paper, it was about protecting society from filth. Corrupting novels, erotic pamphlets, medical texts deemed too frank. In practice, it gave authorities broad powers to raid print shops, seize works, and prosecute publishers. Obscenity wasn't defined precisely. It was whatever a judge decided was too much. And what was too much? Almost anything that hinted at desire. The act turned writing into a minefield. Authors, publishers, even private readers had to tread carefully. Fiction, poetry, scientific texts on sex and reproduction, all could fall under suspicion. A printer who produced too daring a pamphlet might find his presses smashed and his stock burned. A bookseller who stocked the wrong titles could face trial. And an ordinary reader? Even possessing banned works could put you at risk. But it wasn't just printed material. Private letters and poems were also fair game. A diary could betray you. A folded sheet of paper could become evidence. Courts seized personal correspondence, reading it aloud to prove immorality. The written word, which should have been the most private expression, became a liability. Imagine the horror. You write a tender letter to someone you care for, perhaps a love that must be hidden, perhaps a desire you cannot express in daylight. You slip it into an envelope, trusting the post. Weeks later, that same letter is produced in a courtroom, read aloud before strangers, dissected as proof of your corruption. What you meant as intimacy becomes spectacle. This wasn't hypothetical. It happened. The most famous example, of course, is Oscar Wilde. His downfall wasn't just about whispered rumors or theatrical flamboyance. It was about words. Love letters he had written to Lord Alfred Douglas, passionate, flowery, poetic, were seized and read aloud in court. Lines meant to be private suddenly echoed in a public trial, twisted into evidence of gross indecency. Wilde, one of the sharpest wits of his time, was undone not by scandal alone, but by his own handwriting. The image is devastating. Wilde, standing in the dock, listening as his most personal words are paraded before the jury, treated not as art, but as crime. His poetry became pathology. His letters, once declarations of love, became shackles. The courtroom turned intimacy into indictment. And Wilde wasn't alone. Dozens of lesser-known figures suffered similar fates. Morality trials weaponized writing against people, turning paper into evidence and affection into criminality. Diaries were read, poems mocked, private thoughts dragged into the light and declared obscene. The Obscene Publications Act gave society the authority to treat desire not as human, but as dangerous. Let's slip back into POV. You're at your desk again, pen in hand, but now your wrist trembles. The words you want to write crowd your mind, pressing against the walls of silence. But every scratch of ink feels risky. If discovered, these words could condemn you. You imagine strangers poring over them, dissecting each phrase, laughing at each rhyme. You hesitate, pen hovering above paper. The candle sputters. Do you write anyway? Or do you lock the feelings away in silence? Victorian censorship forced thousands into that very choice. Write and risk exposure, or remain silent and safe. It was another layer of control, this time over language itself. The irony, of course, is that the Victorians also adored poetry and letters. Courtship often revolved around them. Lovers exchanged notes, pressed flowers into folded paper, wrote endless verses. Newspapers published sentimental poems, novels brimmed with romance. But step too far beyond the accepted limits, and admiration turned to accusation. Desire was acceptable in fiction, provided it stayed faint, abstract, and respectable. Anything sharper, more explicit, or more real was condemned. It was, in a way, the literary equivalent of women's fashion. A corset for the pen. Your writing could suggest shape, hint at curve, gesture toward desire, but never let it spill too openly. Words, like bodies, had to be tightly laced, controlled, and disguised. The double standard reigned supreme. Male authors were occasionally tolerated for pushing boundaries, their daring framed as genius. Women writers, on the other hand, faced harsher judgment. A woman who wrote too frankly risked her reputation, her income, even her place in society. Some published under male pseudonyms, disguising themselves to slip past censors. Others had to bury their more daring works, leaving manuscripts unpublished, unread, forgotten. How many voices were silenced, we can only guess. The fear of censorship didn't just suppress art. It warped intimacy. Lovers who might have written freely instead second-guessed every word. Couples who exchanged letters sometimes burned them after reading, terrified they could later be used as evidence. The act of saving a memento, the letter pressed in a drawer, the poem tucked into a book, became dangerous. Even memory itself had to be guarded. Now let's return to that immersive moment. You're sitting in court, the judge looming above, the public craning to hear. A letter you once wrote in trembling secrecy is being read aloud, your words tender, flawed, human, are stripped of context, twisted into proof of obscenity. The courtroom laughs at phrases you once thought beautiful. Each sentence cuts deeper than the last. By the time the reading ends, you feel hollow, betrayed by your own pen. That was the Victorian paradox, a culture obsessed with words, yet terrified of their power. They loved novels, poems, letters, but only on their terms. Step outside the invisible boundaries, and words became shackles. And so, many silenced themselves. They chose blank pages over risky ones, silence over exposure. Censorship did what it always does. It didn't just erase obscene writing, it erased honesty. Looking back, the Wilde trial remains the most infamous. His imprisonment destroyed his career, his health, and his freedom. But even beyond Wilde, the countless anonymous voices lost to censorship are perhaps the greater tragedy. All those unwritten poems, those burned letters, those silences forced by fear, a whole shadow archive of human desire that never made it to the page. So, when we think of Victorian obsession with women's bodies, remember that it wasn't only flesh that was controlled, it was also ink. The body was policed, yes, but so was the word. And for many, the word proved even more dangerous. You blow out the candle on your desk. The page before you is blank. Safer that way. Tomorrow, perhaps, you'll dare a line or two. Or perhaps not, because in this world, even your handwriting can betray you. You're standing in front of the mirror in a dimly lit Victorian bedroom, the fire in the grate giving off more smoke than heat. The mirror reflects not only your face, but the weight of 100 invisible rules pressing in around you. Powder must be applied just so. Hair must sit in perfect order. Corset laces must be tight enough to signal refinement, but not so tight that you collapse in the parlor before the tea is served. Every gesture, every glance, every breath is measured, not by science, not by reason, but by the invisible yardstick of society. This was Victorian life for women, not one big spectacle of control, but 1,000 small rituals of surveillance woven into every day. Start with the powders, a faint dusting of lead-based white to keep the skin pale. Too much and you look theatrical, like an actress. And actresses were often considered barely one rung above prostitutes. Too little, and your cheeks look common, too alive, too outdoorsy, suspiciously healthy. The ideal was somewhere in between, pale enough to pass for delicate, yet subtle enough to look natural. And of course, natural in Victorian logic meant hours of artifice. Then came the perfumes. A dab of rose water on the wrists, lavender behind the ears, perhaps violet on a handkerchief. Women weren't supposed to smell like people. They were supposed to smell like gardens in perpetual bloom. Heaven forbid the faintest trace of sweat betray the fact that you were human. Refinement was not about honesty. It was about masking reality. And the corset. Ah, the corset. The silent judge wrapped around your waist. Lacing was often done by another woman, a servant if you were wealthy, a sister or mother if not. There was no escaping the eyes on your body. Too loose, and whispers of sloppiness or even immorality might follow you. Too tight, and you risked fainting in public, which, ironically, could also be fashionable, provided you collapsed gracefully. All of this was rehearsed daily. Young girls grew up watching their mothers and governesses perform these rituals, learning early how to powder, perfume, and lace themselves into acceptability. Silence was taught alongside refinement. Daughters were instructed not to raise their voices, not to speak out of turn, not to let opinions spill too freely. You weren't simply learning etiquette, You were learning how to erase yourself. And if family wasn't enough, society took care of the rest. Neighbors watched, servants gossiped. A careless word, a crooked hem, or an unguarded laugh could fuel whispers that spread like smoke through the drawing rooms. Even the people beneath you in social rank became part of the surveillance network. A maid polishing your shoes might remark to another that your stockings seemed worn. A coachman might mention that you lingered too long speaking to someone. Respectability wasn't guarded by walls. It was guarded by eyes, everywhere, all the time. Step into the immersive POV. You're standing in that mirror, corset tugged tight, powders settled on your face, perfume clinging faintly to your gloves. You force your shoulders back, your spine straight. Behind you, your mother tilts her head, inspecting. A stray hair is tucked back into place. She nods approval, but not without warning. Remember to speak softly, sit still, do not attract the wrong kind of attention. You nod. Of course you nod. There is no alternative. Even once you leave the house, the performance continues. Walks down the street were not casual affairs. They were parades of modesty. How you held yourself, how far you stepped, whether your gaze lingered too long on anyone, all of it could be read and judged. Servants, shopkeepers, and strangers in the street became unofficial auditors of your virtue. Gossip was currency, and everyone carried a little. This constant surveillance shaped not only how women acted, but how they thought. Over time, you no longer needed a governess or a neighbor to police you. You began to police yourself. You looked into that mirror and saw not just your reflection, but the imagined gaze of society staring back. Am I pale enough? Straight enough? Silent enough? Virtuous enough? Surveillance didn't need guards or locks. It worked because it lived inside your own head. And let's not forget the absurdity. Refinement could mean carrying smelling salts in your reticule, just in case the faintness from your corset or the stench of the streets overwhelmed you. It could mean rehearsing your laugh until it sounded musical, but never too loud. It could mean measuring your waist before a dinner party, because heaven forbid you expand an inch between soup and pudding. These weren't just habits. They were rituals, acts of devotion to an altar of social approval. Sarcasm practically drips from it. Nothing says health like arsenic wafers, lead powders, and fainting into your consommé, all in the name of refinement. What's remarkable is how ordinary it all became. For the Victorians, these rituals weren't seen as absurd. They were simply life. Powdering, perfuming, lacing, silencing. It was as natural as eating breakfast. Girls grew into women, never questioning why, because everyone else was doing the same. The extraordinary cruelty of it was hidden by the banality of repetition. And the cost? Enormous. Physically, the powders and corsets and perfumes damaged health. Psychologically, the constant surveillance crushed individuality. Socially, it created a culture of suspicion and gossip, where women were both victims and enforcers of the same rules. You might suffer under the gaze, but you also learned to wield it, whispering about others just as they whispered about you. The system perpetuated itself, generation after generation. Step back once more into POV. You're at a tea party now, sitting upright, smiling faintly. Your corset pinches, but you ignore it. You sip delicately, careful not to stain your gloves. Conversation flows around you, harmless chatter about weather, fashion, neighbors. But every word, every glance feels weighted. Did you smile too much at that young man? Did you laugh too loudly at the hostess's joke? Somewhere in the corner, someone's eyes are watching, calculating, storing away details for later gossip. The truth is, everyday rituals of surveillance were never about beauty alone. They were about control. The powders, perfumes, corsets, and rules weren't just adornments. They were chains. Polite, perfumed chains that bound women in place. Looking back, it's easy to marvel at the hypocrisy. A society that wrote poetry about purity and painted portraits of delicate women spent its mornings lacing, powdering, sniffing, and gossiping into existence a version of femininity that never truly existed. Women were trained to embody ideals so fragile they had to be propped up by chemicals, fabrics, and silence. And you, standing before that mirror, feel the weight of it all. Not just the corset pressing your ribs, not just the powder settling on your skin, but the 1,000 invisible eyes you carry with you everywhere. You are never alone. You are always on display. And the cruelest part? You are taught to believe this is normal. Because in Victorian society, surveillance wasn't an event. It was a daily ritual, quiet, relentless, and inescapable. The lamp flickers as you lean over your desk, quill scratching cautiously against paper. You write quickly, the words tumbling out, each one a secret. Then you pause, listening. The house is quiet, too quiet. If anyone discovered this journal, it could mean ridicule, punishment, or worse. So you tuck the notebook into a hidden drawer, stack a pile of dull housekeeping manuals on top, and pray no one ever finds it. Because in Victorian society, silence was survival. But silence was also suffocating. And inevitably, cracks began to appear. For all the corsets, powders, perfumes, chastity devices, and rituals of surveillance, women weren't simply passive objects. Many found ways to resist, even if resistance looked small, quiet, and fragile by our standards. It might have been nothing more than keeping a diary, a place where you could finally admit you were miserable, where you could record the absurdity of fainting into a soup tureen because of a corset, or where you could confess to feeling attraction you weren't allowed to name. Private journals became pressure valves. Some were carefully coded, written in abbreviations or symbols only the author understood. Others were hidden so well they weren't found for generations. And when they were, they revealed not delicate angels in the house, but sharp minds railing against absurd rules. Then there were letters. Yes, letters were risky, as we saw with Oscar Wilde and countless morality trials, but they were also lifelines. Women exchanged coded notes with friends, lovers, sometimes even with sympathetic men. A sentence that looked bland to outsiders might carry a deeper meaning for the recipient. A pressed flower tucked into the envelope, a shared book with underlined passages. These became the subtext of rebellion. Feminist writing also began to creep into public discourse, often cloaked in respectable language. Pamphlets questioned the safety of cosmetics, noting that lead and arsenic seemed less like beauty aids and more like slow poison. Doctors began to publish critiques of tight lacing, warning that corsets displaced organs and ruined health. Early feminists seized on this medical evidence to argue that fashion was less about beauty and more about control. Why, they asked, should women risk their lives just to fit an ideal silhouette? The critiques weren't always radical. Some framed their arguments in the language of duty, suggesting women should stay healthy for their husbands or children. But beneath the surface was a growing recognition that the system itself was flawed. The cracks were widening, and some women did more than resist quietly. They learned to manipulate the rules to their advantage. A wealthy widow, for example, might embrace the stereotype of fragile femininity to deflect suspicion while she managed her own finances or pursued relationships outside convention. A governess might use her reputation for modesty as a shield, giving her room to maneuver within households where gossip reigned. Even actresses, often condemned as immoral, learned to turn scandal into currency, using notoriety to carve out independence unavailable to respectable women. These weren't revolutions, at least not yet. They were survival tactics. But survival tactics, repeated often enough, can turn into momentum. Step into POV. You're scribbling in your hidden journal, pouring out thoughts you'd never dare say aloud. Your hand cramps, but you don't stop. You confess that you hate the corset, that you hate being measured by your waist more than by your mind. You confess that you felt a flicker of desire when you read a certain poem, and that you resented being told desire was disease. You close the book, tuck it away, and breathe. For the first time all day, you feel honest. That honesty, however small, is rebellion. The cracks also showed in literature. Novelists began to create female characters who resisted the angel in the house ideal. Some were tragic figures, destroyed by society for daring to stray, but their stories revealed the cruelty of the system. Others hinted at new possibilities, women who questioned, who pushed back, who refused to disappear quietly. Readers devoured these works, often debating their morality in parlors and newspapers. The very fact that such debates were happening meant the silence was breaking. Of course, resistance came at a cost. Diaries, if discovered, could be used against their authors. Letters could betray their writers in court. Feminist pamphlets were mocked, censored, or dismissed as hysterical. Women who stepped too far outside the lines risked ruin. And yet many kept writing, kept questioning, kept finding ways to twist the rules. It's tempting to dismiss these quiet rebellions as too small to matter. But history is built on such cracks. A diary hidden in a drawer may not topple a system, but it preserves a truth for future generations. A pamphlet questioning arsenic cosmetics may not free women overnight, but it plants a seed of doubt. A woman using her frailty to shield her independence may not seem heroic, but in her survival, she opens space for others. Even gossip, the very tool of surveillance, sometimes became a tool of rebellion. Whisper networks carried warnings, advice, and encouragement. Women told each other which doctors to avoid, which teachers were cruel, which households were dangerous. They may have been trapped in a system designed to watch them, but they also watched back, and the cracks kept spreading. By the late 19th century, suffrage movements were gathering steam. The women who had once scribbled in journals or hidden letters began to step into public activism. They spoke openly, marched, published newspapers, demanded rights. But those later victories rested on the quieter rebellions of earlier decades. The cracks had to form before the walls could fall. Sarcasm aside, it's hard not to admire the sheer persistence of these women. Imagine living under endless scrutiny, endless rules, endless chains of powder, corsets, chastity, gossip, and still finding a way to write, to speak, to carve out small spaces of freedom. That determination, quiet though it may have been, was the beginning of change. So let's settle back into that room, with the journal tucked safely away. The candle sputters, the house creaks. You whisper to yourself the words you dare not write. I am more than this. You blow out the flame, slip into bed, and hope no one ever discovers the hidden drawer. But history has a way of uncovering hidden things. And when it does, it reveals that even in the most suffocating of systems, people resist. Quietly, imperfectly, sometimes invisibly, but they resist. That's the real story of the Victorian obsession with women's bodies. Not just control, not just surveillance, but the cracks that appeared despite it all. Because even in a world determined to silence you, the act of whispering to yourself, the act of writing one forbidden sentence in a secret journal, was a revolution of its own. The lamps have been extinguished, curtains are drawn, fireplaces reduced to embers. In the quiet of a Victorian home, nightfall doesn't bring freedom. It simply presses the silence deeper. Another day of powders, corset checks, whispered rules, and invisible eyes has ended. You've survived. This was the rhythm of the era, obsession woven into every detail of a woman's life, from the measured inches of a waist to the carefully powdered pallor of a cheek, from the proof demanded on a wedding night to the scent expected to mask the simple reality of being human. Hair was judged, skin was scrutinized, voices were silenced. Even desire itself was dragged into the clinic, labeled a disease, and treated with humming machines. It's almost laughable, if it weren't so exhausting. And yet, somehow, women endured. Some resisted, quietly scribbling truths in journals they prayed no one would find. Others manipulated the rules just enough to survive with a sliver of agency intact. The cracks in the system never fully disappeared, and those cracks are what eventually let the light in. So as you drift now towards sleep, remember, you've walked through a world where every gesture, every breath, every flicker of individuality was measured and controlled. A palace of rules, fading now into silence. Another day survived, another story put to rest. Of course, this is the part where I lean on you. Subscribing here means at least someone acknowledges you exist. Unlike most Victorian husbands, who only noticed the furniture when it got in their way. And if you'd like to take these stories with you ad-free, my first audio collection is waiting in the description and the pinned comment. Only a handful of copies are available right now. Don't miss out. It's the one way to escape the algorithm's corset and still support what I do. Finally, when you subscribe, when you comment, when you choose to stick around, it tells me that this work matters, that you see me, that you're willing to keep these voices alive. Unlike the Victorians, you don't leave me talking to an empty room, and that's no small kindness. Good night.